The sky above Earth burned orange on the day the Valori came. Nobody had expected it. Not the generals, not the scientists, not the billions of ordinary people who looked up and saw the heavens split open like a wound that would never heal. It was the year 2187, and humanity had just taken its first steps beyond the solar system, sending brave men and women to a small colony around a distant star, feeling proud and hopeful and full of dreams about the future. Then the Valori Dominion arrived, and every single one of those dreams turned to ash. 12,000 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and filled the space around Earth like a swarm of metal insects, each one larger than anything humans had ever built, each one carrying enough firepower to turn a continent into glass. The Terran Accord, the united government of all humanity, scrambled its entire fleet. 60 ships, crewed by the bravest pilots Earth had ever produced, to meet the invaders. The battle lasted 9 minutes. Every human ship was destroyed, and the Valori did not lose a single vessel. High Archon Thyral Ekvos, the supreme ruler of the Dominion, broadcast a message to every screen and every speaker on the planet, and his voice was cold and empty, like the void between stars. "You will submit," he said, "or your world will be sterilized, and your species will be remembered by no one." The leaders of the Terran Accord looked at each other across a long table, and they saw the faces of 11 billion people reflected in each other's eyes, mothers and fathers and children who had done nothing wrong, who simply wanted to live, and they made the only choice they could. Earth surrendered. Within days, the Valori landed their forces on every continent, and the occupation began with terrible speed and efficiency. Humanity was classified as a Tier 9 servitor species, which was the lowest rank in Dominion's ancient caste system, a system that had been used for 10,000 years to sort hundreds of alien races into categories of worth. Tier 9 meant you were considered barely intelligent, good for nothing except hard labor, mining dangerous materials, and dying on the front lines of the Dominion's endless wars against enemies on the edges of the galaxy. The Valori governor assigned to Earth was a tall, thin creature called Prelate Savan, and he looked at humans the way a farmer looks at cattle, with ownership in his eyes and nothing even close to respect. Under Savan's command, the separation began. Millions of humans were loaded onto massive transport ships and sent to distant worlds across the Dominion. Mining colonies, where the air was poison, agricultural planets, where they worked under 3 burning suns, and war zones, where they were given broken weapons and told to charge. Families were torn apart without mercy, and the screams of children, being pulled from their parents, echoed through loading docks on every continent. Among those taken was a woman named Ilara Voss. She had been a captain in the Terran Accord military, a decorated officer who had served with honor and courage. And when the Valori came, she had fought in the 9-minute battle and survived only because her ship's escape pod had launched seconds before the hull collapsed around her. Now she wore chains instead of a uniform. Ilara was shipped to a scorched and brutal world called Kethera 6, where she was forced to work in the Ashen Maw mines, massive underground tunnels where enslaved humans dug for rare minerals that powered the Dominion's war machines. The heat was unbearable. The air was thick with dust that burned the lungs, and the Valori overseers carried electric whips that they used freely and without hesitation. But Ilara did not break. She watched her captors with careful, quiet eyes. Everything they said, learning their language word by word, studying the way they organized their patrols, memorizing the schedules and the codes, and the weaknesses they did not even know they had. She was not just surviving, she was preparing. Back on Earth, another kind of resistance was being born in the shadows. Dr. Idris Okonkwo had been one of humanity's greatest physicists, a man whose mind could bend the laws of the universe into shapes no one else could imagine. And when the Valori discovered his intelligence, they did not send him to the mines. Instead, they forced him to work in a weapons research laboratory, surrounded by armed guards, tasked with improving the Dominion's already terrifying arsenal. They thought they had made him into a tool. They were wrong. Every night, after the guards changed shifts and the cameras cycled through their blind spots, Idris copied schematics and technical data onto tiny hidden devices no bigger than a grain of rice, and he passed them through a network of human workers who moved between facilities: cleaners, cooks, maintenance workers, the invisible people that empires never bother to watch. This network had a name, whispered only in the darkest and most private moments between trusted souls. They called it the Ember. Because an ember is a small and quiet thing, easy to ignore, easy to overlook, but given the right fuel and the right wind, an ember can become a fire that swallows everything. Months turned into a year, and the year turned into something heavier, something that pressed down on the shoulders of every enslaved human like a weight made of silence and grief. On Cathara V, Ilara worked the mines by day and taught herself Valori combat techniques by night, using stolen training manuals that she read by the dim glow of mineral deposits in the tunnels. She shared what she learned with others, quietly, carefully, never more than a few trusted souls at a time, and she began to see something growing in the eyes of the people around her. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for what lived inside them. It was something harder, something that had been forged in the furnace of humiliation and loss, something that the Valori had put there without ever meaning to. It was rage. Patient, silent, burning rage. And then came the day that changed everything for Ilara. She was working in Tunnel 7 when a commotion broke out near the entrance, and she heard shouting in the Valori language, followed by a sound that made her blood freeze, the high, terrified scream of a child. She pushed through the crowd of workers and saw a Valori overseer standing over a small boy, no older than 8 or 9, who had collapsed from exhaustion and could not stand. The overseer was shouting at the child to get up, and when the boy tried and failed, the overseer raised his electric whip and brought it down again and again and again. Ilara lunged forward, but the humans on either side of her grabbed her arms and held her back, because they knew that if she attacked the overseer, they would all be killed, every single one of them. So she stood there, held in place by the desperate hands of her own people, and she watched the boy stop screaming, and then stop moving, and then stop breathing. The overseer looked at the small, still body on the ground, and said something in Valori that translated roughly to, "Clean this up," before walking away as if nothing had happened. Ilara stood in the dust and the heat, and the silence that followed, and something inside her locked into place, like the final piece of a machine that had been waiting a very long time to be completed. She did not cry. She did not scream. She looked at the faces of the humans around her, broken, grieving, furious, afraid, and she made a vow so deep and so absolute that it became the foundation of everything she would do for the rest of her life. Never again. She would tear this empire apart with her bare hands if she had to, and she would make the Valori understand, truly and completely understand, what it meant to enslave a species that would rather burn the galaxy to the ground than live one more day in chains. The Dominion had no idea what it had created, but it was going to find out. 5 years had passed since the chains first fell on humanity, and the Valori Dominion believed that the conquest was complete. They believed that the humans had accepted their place at the bottom of the caste system, that the fire had gone out of them, that the species was broken beyond repair. They believed this because the humans wanted them to believe it. On Cathara V, Ilara Voss had spent 5 years building something extraordinary beneath the surface of the scorched and brutal mining world. Not just tunnels for ore, but tunnels for revolution. She had organized over 3,000 enslaved humans into a disciplined and deadly covert force, And she had done it so carefully and so patiently that the Valori overseers never noticed a thing. Every stolen weapon was hidden in walls that had been hollowed out behind false rock faces that looked perfectly natural to anyone who did not know where to press. Every patrol route was mapped and memorized by teams of human runners who communicated using a code language built from old Earth slang that no Valori translator could decipher. Every new arrival to the mines was watched for weeks before being approached, and only those who could be trusted with their lives were brought into the fold. Ilara ran the operation with the precision of a military commander, because that was exactly what she was. Not a broken slave, not a defeated soldier, but a captain who had simply been waiting for the right moment to strike. And she was not alone. Across dozens of Dominion worlds, similar cells had taken root like seeds planted in hostile soil, each one growing quietly in the dark, each one connected to the others through a fragile but brilliant encrypted network. That network existed because of Dr. Idris Okonkwo. Back on Earth, working under the watchful eyes of Valori guards in the weapons research laboratory, Idris had spent 5 years playing the role of the obedient servant while secretly building the most important communication system in human history. He had designed it using principles the Valori did not understand. Quantum entanglement signatures hidden inside the Dominion's own data streams, piggybacking on their military channels like a whisper riding on the back of a shout. The Valori never detected it, because they never imagined that a Tier 9 species could understand their technology well enough to exploit it. This was the great and fatal flaw of the Dominion. They had built their entire civilization on the belief that the caste system was natural and true, that some species were simply born superior to others, and that humans were barely more than clever animals. This belief made them blind, and their blindness was humanity's greatest weapon. But Idris had discovered something even more powerful than a communication network. Deep inside old Terran Accord archives, files that the Valori had seized but never bothered to translate, because they assumed human science was primitive. Idris found references to a classified program called Project Prometheus. It had been developed in secret during the years before First Contact, when Earth's military leaders had feared that the universe might not be friendly, and they had been right to fear. Project Prometheus was a weapons system that harnessed zero-point energy, the fundamental power that exists in the fabric of space itself, and compressed it into gravitational warheads of almost unimaginable destructive force. A single Prometheus warhead could destabilize the core of a planet, cracking it open from the inside like an egg, turning a living world into a cloud of molten debris. 3 completed prototypes had been built, and hidden inside a facility buried deep within Earth's moon, sealed behind doors that only a handful of people had ever known about. And all of those people were now dead, all except one, whose name had been buried in the files alongside the schematics. Idris stared at the data on his hidden screen and felt his hands tremble, not with fear, but with the terrible weight of what he now held: the power to destroy worlds, the power to make the Dominion pay for every life it had taken, every family it had torn apart, every child it had worked to death in its mines. He was not sure if this made him a savior or a monster, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he could not let this knowledge die with him. Meanwhile, someone on the other side of the war was beginning to see what the rest of the Dominion refused to see. Sub-Commander Aelith Ran was a Valori intelligence officer stationed aboard the surveillance cruiser Vigilance, and her job was to monitor servitor species for signs of disobedience. She was young for her rank, sharp-minded, and cursed with something that most Valori officers considered a weakness. The past year she had noticed patterns that did not make sense. Small things at first, like production numbers in mining colonies that dipped by exactly 2% every third cycle, or supply manifests that showed tiny discrepancies in the amount of refined ore being shipped. Individually, these anomalies meant nothing, but together they formed a picture that made Aelith's stomach tighten with unease. Someone was stealing materials, and they were doing it with a level of coordination that should have been impossible for a Tier 9 species. She brought her findings to her superior, Admiral Keth Varanus, a decorated officer who had served the Dominion for 40 years, and who looked at Aelith the way one might look at a child who was afraid of shadows. "They are humans," he said, his tone carrying the particular kind of contempt that only true believers in the caste system could produce. "They dig holes and carry rocks, and sometimes they die, and that is the full extent of their capability. But the patterns," Aelith began. "Are coincidence," the Admiral interrupted. "You are wasting valuable intelligence resources on livestock, Sub-Commander, and I suggest you redirect your attention to threats that actually exist." Aelith left the Admiral's office, with her jaw tight and her fists clenched at her sides, and she made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would continue the investigation alone, without authorization, without support, because something in her gut told her that the humans were more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. She was right, but by the time the Dominion understood that, it would be far too late. In the deep places of the galaxy, away from the eyes of the Valori, Ilara made contact with two other species who had suffered under the Dominion's boot. The first were the Queth, insectoid creatures with 6 arms and minds built for engineering, who maintained the Empire's infrastructure, because no other species could match their technical skill, and who were treated as expendable tools despite being essential to everything the Dominion built. The second were the Larathi, graceful aquatic beings who possessed natural telepathic abilities, and were used as living communication relays, forced to link minds across vast distances so that the Dominion's admirals could coordinate their fleets without the delays of normal communication. Both species had been enslaved for centuries, and both had long since given up any hope of freedom. But Ilara did not offer them hope. She offered them something better. She offered them a plan. The alliance was fragile and built on the thinnest thread of trust, because none of these species had any reason to believe in each other, and all of them had every reason to be afraid. But fear, Ilara had learned, was not the opposite of courage. Fear was the fuel that courage burned. They worked together in secret, the Keth providing technical expertise to build better weapons and disable Valori security systems, the Larathi providing secure telepathic communication channels that no electronic surveillance could detect, and the humans providing the one thing that neither of the other species had left, the will to fight no matter the cost. And then, on a night that would be remembered across the galaxy for as long as civilizations existed, Dr. Idris Okonkwo sat alone in his hidden workshop beneath the ruins of old Nairobi, and he activated the quantum network for the final time. His fingers moved across the interface, composing a message that would be sent simultaneously to every ember cell on every world where humans drew breath in chains. The message was a single word, and it carried within it 5 years of suffering and silence and rage and preparation. The word was ignite. And across the stars, in mines and factories and barracks and labor camps, thousands of humans read that word and felt something ignite inside their chests. Not hope, not fear, but the cold and certain knowledge that the time for patience was over. The ember had burned in silence for 5 long years. Now it was ready to become a fire that would consume an empire. It began at exactly the same moment on 47 worlds. In mining colonies and factory complexes and military installations scattered across the vast territory of the Valori Dominion, humans who had spent 5 years pretending to be broken suddenly showed the galaxy what they truly were. On Kethera 6, Ilara Voss stood in the darkness of Tunnel 7, the same tunnel where she had watched a child die years ago, and she looked at the faces of the men and women gathered around her, their eyes burning with a light that no chain could ever extinguish. "Tonight we stop being slaves," she said, and her voice was steady and calm, and carried the weight of every single day she had spent preparing for this moment. "Tonight, we take back what they stole from us." The Kethera uprising began with silence. Keth engineers who had been secretly reprogramming the mining colony's security systems activated their work, and every camera, every alarm, every electronic lock in the facility went dark at the same instant. The Vylori guards did not even have time to reach for their weapons before human teams moved through the corridors like shadows, taking them down with brutal efficiency, using tools and stolen sidearms and bare hands when nothing else was available. Ilara led the assault on the orbital defense platform, a massive weapons station that hung above the planet like a metal moon, bristling with enough firepower to destroy a fleet. The Vylori crew aboard the platform numbered 200, and they were confident in their safety, because no Tier 9 species had ever seized a military installation in the entire 10,000-year history of the Dominion. They were still confident when the airlocks opened and human fighters poured in from maintenance tunnels that the Keth had quietly connected to the main corridors over a period of months. The battle for the platform lasted less than an hour. When it was over, Ilara stood at the command console and opened a broadcast channel that reached every receiver in the system, and she spoke words that would be recorded and replayed across the galaxy for generations. "Kethara is free." 3 words, simple, direct, and devastating. On world after world, the same scene played out, with variations, but always with the same result. Humans rising up with a coordination and ferocity that the Vylori had never imagined possible. On the agricultural planet of Fessin 4, enslaved farmers used the massive harvesting machines as weapons, driving them through the walls of the Vylori garrison, while strike teams hit the armory from 3 directions at once. On the industrial world of Morvain, human factory workers who had been building warship components for years used their knowledge to sabotage the entire production line, triggering a chain of explosions that lit up the night sky like a second sunrise. Disabled critical infrastructure while the Lyrathi severed the Dominion's telepathic communication relays, plunging entire sectors into informational darkness. The Vylori High Command received fragmented, panicked reports from across their territory, and for the first time in living memory, the rulers of the galaxy did not know what was happening. And then came Earth. The liberation of humanity's homeworld had been the centerpiece of every plan Ilara and Idris had ever made, and it was executed with a precision that would be studied in military academies for centuries. Sleeper cells that had been embedded inside every major Vylori installation on the planet activated simultaneously, and the occupation force, which had grown lazy and complacent after 5 years of unchallenged control, was caught completely off guard. The first target was the planetary communication hub in what had once been Geneva, and when it fell, the Vylori forces on Earth lost the ability to coordinate with each other or call for reinforcements. The second target was the weapons depot outside of Old Moscow, and when human fighters seized it, they suddenly had access to enough military hardware to arm 10,000 soldiers. The third and final target was the command fortress of Prelate Saivon himself, a massive structure that had been built on top of the ruins of the old United Nations headquarters, because the Vylori had a taste for symbolic cruelty. Saivon's fortress was supposed to be impenetrable, protected by energy shields and automated defense turrets and a garrison of the Dominion's elite soldiers. But the shields required power, and the power came from generators maintained by Keth engineers who had been waiting 5 years for this night. The shields fell. The turrets went silent, and the doors opened from the inside, because the human servants who cleaned the floors and prepared the food and were treated as invisible had been members of the Ember all along. Sergeant Rook Tanaka led the assault team that breached Saivon's personal chambers, and he found the prelate standing at his window, watching the fires that burned across the city below. The fires of liberation, of 5 years of rage, finally unleashed. Sci-Fi turned to face the humans who had come for him. And even now, even at the end, his eyes held nothing but contempt. "You are making a mistake," he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never once in his life questioned his own superiority. "The Dominion will crush this pathetic rebellion, and every human on every world will pay for your foolishness." Rook looked at the creature who had overseen the enslavement of his entire species, who had signed the orders that separated families and worked children to death, and treated 11 billion people as livestock, and he felt a cold fury that went deeper than anger, peaceful in its totality. "You gave Earth a choice once," Rook said, and his voice was quiet and even. "Submit or be destroyed. Those were your words, and now I'm giving you the same choice." Sci-Fi stared at him for a long moment, and then he spat in Rook's face. Rook did not flinch. He wiped his cheek with the back of his hand and nodded to his team, and they took the prelate away, not to be executed in the dark, but to be held for a public trial, because Alara had been very clear that humanity would not become the monsters that had enslaved them. While Earth burned with the fires of freedom, something even more significant was happening on the moon. Dr. Idris Okonkwo and a team of 12 engineers and soldiers had reached the hidden lunar facility where Project Prometheus had been sealed away before the invasion, and they stood before a vault door that had not been opened in over a decade. The codes from the old archives worked, slid open, with a sound like a long-held breath finally being released. Inside, resting in magnetic containment cradles, were 3 Prometheus warheads, each one no larger than a ground transport vehicle, each one containing enough compressed zero-point energy to crack a planet in half. Idris looked at them and felt a wave of emotion so complex and so powerful that he could not have named it if he had tried. Relief that they existed, horror at what they could do, and a grim understanding that the galaxy was about to change in ways that could never be undone. He transmitted a coded message to Alara on the quantum network, and it was the shortest and most important message he had ever sent. "Prometheus is live. 3 warheads secured and operational." Alara received the message in the command center of the captured orbital platform above Cathara V, and she closed her eyes for just a moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of what humanity now knew. Possessed, they had the power to destroy worlds. The question that would define everything that came next was whether they would use it. She did not have long to consider the question, because at that very moment, the Vylori High Command was responding to the uprising with the full and terrible might of the Dominion. High Archon Thyral Ekthos, the same being who had conquered Earth 5 years ago, stood before his war council and issued an order that sent a chill through every officer in the room. "Activate the purification fleet," he commanded, and his voice was not angry. It was cold, final, and empty of mercy. 40,000 warships will converge on the Sol system, and when they arrive, Earth will be scoured clean of every living thing upon it, not as punishment, but as a lesson to every species in the Dominion about the cost of defiance. The order went out, and across the galaxy, the largest military force ever assembled began to move toward humanity's home. Alara received the intelligence from Lirathi's scouts, and she understood what was coming. Not a battle, but an extinction. She looked at the stars through the viewport of the orbital platform, and she made a decision. If the Dominion wanted to bring its full wrath against Earth, then Earth would answer with a wrath of its own, the kind that empires remember forever, the kind that makes the galaxy itself tremble. The night the stars bled had only just begun. The purification fleet came out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and when it arrived, the darkness of space itself seemed to disappear behind a wall of metal and light. 40,000 warships, each one a cathedral of destruction, each one carrying crews who had been told that they were coming to exterminate vermin, spread across the void in a formation so vast that it would have taken a beam of light several seconds to cross from one end to the other. Ilara stood on the bridge of the captured Valori cruiser that now served as her flagship, and she looked at the tactical display and saw the enemy fleet rendered as a sea of red icons that filled the screen from edge to edge. 400 ships. That was all humanity had. Some were stolen Valori vessels crewed by humans who had taught themselves to operate alien technology through years of secret study, and some were old Terran Accord warships that had been salvaged from the wreckage of the 9-minute battle and rebuilt with Keth engineering, and some were strange hybrid craft that combined human stubbornness with alien ingenuity in ways that had never been attempted before. 400 against 40,000. The numbers were not just bad, they were impossible. But Ilara had not designed her strategy around winning. She had designed it around making the Dominion understand that some victories cost more than they are worth. She opened a channel to every human ship in the fleet, and her voice carried across the void to the ears of every man and woman who had chosen to stand between the Dominion and their home. "They are coming to erase us," she said, and there was no fear in her voice, only a calm and terrible clarity. "They believe that because they have more ships and more guns, the outcome is already decided, and maybe they are right about the math, but they are wrong about us, because we are not fighting to survive today. Are fighting to make sure that no empire in this galaxy ever looks at another species and thinks it can be enslaved without consequence." She paused, and in the silence, every crew member on every ship felt something pass through them. Not courage exactly, but something older and deeper. Something that lived in the bones of every human who had ever stood against impossible odds and refused to kneel. "Make them remember us," Ilara said, and the channel went silent. The Battle of Saul began. The Valori fleet advanced in the standard Dominion attack formation, a massive wedge designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer volume of fire. And the first volleys turned the space between the two fleets into a storm of energy and light. Human ships died in the opening minutes, dozens of them, torn apart by concentrated fire from capital ships that outgunned them in every measurable way. But the humans did not break formation, and they did not retreat. Happened next was something that the Valori had never encountered in 10,000 years of galactic warfare. The human fleet split into hundreds of small, fast groups that darted between the massive Valori warships like wolves among elephants, and they fought with a reckless, desperate ferocity that defied every tactical model the Dominion had ever developed. When a human ship was crippled and could no longer fight, its crew did not surrender. They aimed their dying vessel at the nearest enemy capital ship and accelerated to maximum speed, turning themselves into a weapon one final time. When human pilots ran out of ammunition, they rammed their fighters into the engine sections of enemy cruisers, sacrificing themselves to create chain reactions that consumed ships 1,000 times their size. When boarding parties breached Valori vessels, the human soldiers fought with a fury that made the Dominion's elite warriors, soldiers who had conquered hundreds of worlds, pale in comparison. Worlds fall back in genuine fear. The Valori had expected to crush an inferior species, but instead they found themselves fighting something they had no framework to understand. A people who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Sub-Commander Aelith Rand watched the battle from the bridge of her surveillance cruiser, and she felt something crack inside the foundation of everything she had been taught to believe. These were not Tier 9 animals. These were warriors of a caliber that rivaled anything the Dominion had ever faced. And the fact that the entire Valori civilization had failed to see this was not just an intelligence failure, it was a moral failure. The battle raged for hours, and the human fleet was being destroyed, slowly, inevitably, ship by ship. But the cost to the purification fleet was staggering. Over 6,000 Vylori warships had been damaged or destroyed, and the fleet's advance had been slowed to a crawl. And the admirals who had expected a quick extermination were beginning to feel something unfamiliar creeping into their thoughts. Doubt. And then Dr. Idris Okonkwo played humanity's final card. Deep inside the captured lunar facility, Idris and his team activated the first Prometheus warhead and loaded it into a launch system that the Keth had built using stolen Dominion slipgate technology. The same faster-than-light gates that the Vylori used to move their fleets across the galaxy in moments. The target coordinates had been calculated months ago, verified by Lyrathi telepaths who had secretly mapped every slipgate route in the Dominion. And when Idris pressed the launch command, his hand was steady, even though his heart was breaking. The warhead entered the slipgate and vanished. Moments later, it emerged in orbit above Valor Prime, the ancient and beautiful homeworld of the Vylori species, the seat of their civilization for over 10,000 years, a world of silver cities and crystal oceans and towers that touched the clouds. The warhead detonated. The zero-point energy released by the device was beyond anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. A pulse of gravitational force so immense that it reached into the core of the planet and disrupted the fundamental forces that held it together. The core destabilized. Continents cracked like ice on a frozen lake, and massive fissures opened across the surface, swallowing cities that had stood for millennia, and the oceans boiled away into steam that rose into an atmosphere that was already burning. Valor Prime died in fire and thunder and silence, because in space there is no sound, and the death of a world is a quiet thing when viewed from far enough away. The news reached the purification fleet within minutes, carried by emergency communication relays that screamed the impossible truth across every channel. Gone. The effect on the Vylori fleet was immediate and devastating. Ships broke formation as crews panicked, and officers who had been giving calm orders moments ago stared at their screens with expressions of shock so profound that it resembled a kind of death in itself. But Alara was not finished. The second Prometheus warhead launched through another slipgate, and this one was aimed at Cathara 9, the Dominion's greatest shipyard world, where half of their military fleet had been built. A world of orbital factories and construction platforms that represented centuries of industrial might. Cathara 9 shattered like glass, and the shipyards that had built the instruments of oppression for 100 generations were reduced to a ring of glowing debris. Aboard her surveillance cruiser, Sub-Commander Aelith Ran watched the data feeds that showed her civilization dying, and she felt the entire architecture of her beliefs collapse around her like a building with no foundation. She had been raised to believe that the Vylori were the rightful rulers of the galaxy, that the caste system was the natural order, that species like humans were lesser beings who existed to serve. And now those lesser beings had done something that no species in the history of the Dominion had ever accomplished. They had struck at the heart of the Empire and torn it out. Aelith opened a direct communication channel to Alara's flagship, and when the human commander's face appeared on her screen, she did not threaten, and she did not negotiate. She asked a single question, and her voice was raw, with a grief so deep it had no bottom. Why? Alara looked at the Vylori officer, and for a moment something passed between them. Not understanding, not forgiveness, but a recognition that they were both standing in the ruins of worlds they had loved. "You taught us what empires understand," Alara said, and her voice was cold and final, and carried no satisfaction. "We were good students." The channel closed. The purification fleet fractured. Some ships turned and fled toward what remained of Vylori space. Some surrendered and powered down their weapons, and some fought on, with the desperate fury of those who have nothing left to lose. The battle continued for hours more, and it was ugly and brutal, and full of death on both sides, but the outcome was no longer in question. The Dominion's spine was broken. When the last enemy warship either fled or surrendered or burned, Ilara stood on her bridge, surrounded by the exhausted and wounded survivors of humanity's most terrible day, and she looked at the tactical display that now showed the Sol system clear of hostile forces. They had won, if what had happened could be called winning. She thought about the Valori civilians on the world she had destroyed, the children, the families, the ordinary people who had nothing to do with the decisions of their rulers, and she felt a weight settle onto her shoulders that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. The third Prometheus warhead remained in its cradle on the moon, unfired and waiting. Ilara had aimed it at the Throne of Stars, the Dominion's sacred capital station, the seat of the High Archon himself, and she had made sure that every Valori commander knew exactly where it was pointed, not as a weapon, but as a promise. Touch humanity again, and there will be nothing left of your civilization but dust and memory. The war was over. The reckoning was just beginning. 6 months after the Battle of Sol, the galaxy was a different place. The Valori Dominion, the empire that had ruled over 400 species for 10,000 years, the civilization that had believed with absolute certainty that it would endure forever, was collapsing from the inside out, like a building whose foundations had been pulled away. More than 200 servitor species had risen in revolt across Dominion space, inspired by what the humans had done, emboldened by the proof that the masters were not invincible after all. The Keth reclaimed their engineering stations and refused to maintain any system that served Valori military interests, which meant that half the Empire's infrastructure went dark within weeks. The Larathi severed the telepathic communication networks that the Dominion depended on, and suddenly the admirals and governors who had once commanded fleets across light years could not even send a message to the next. Smaller species, the Drenai, the Voskari, the Tellurians, and dozens more whose names had been forgotten under centuries of oppression, rose up and seized control of their own worlds, tearing down the statues of Valori conquerors and burning the administrative buildings where their chains had been managed. The caste system that had defined galactic civilization for 100 centuries was disintegrating, and nothing would ever put it back together. In the midst of this upheaval, representatives from every free species gathered on a neutral station in deep space to form something new, the Galactic Assembly of Free Species, a governing body built not on hierarchy and conquest, but on the radical and untested idea that every sentient being had the right to determine its own future. Ilara Voss was asked to speak first. She stood before the assembly, hundreds of delegates from dozens of species, some of whom had tentacles, and some of whom had wings, and some of whom existed as clouds of luminous gas. And she looked out at a galaxy that was broken and afraid, and desperate for someone to lead it out of the darkness. The delegates expected her to claim that role, because it was humans who had shattered the Dominion, humans who had proven that the old order was built on lies, and in the logic of power, it was humans who had earned the right to rule what came next. Ilara understood that logic, and she rejected it completely. "I know what many of you are thinking," she said, and her voice filled the chamber with a quiet strength that made every delegate lean forward to listen. "You are thinking that humanity broke the chains, and therefore humanity should hold the keys. And I understand why that makes sense to you. It is the way things have always worked in this galaxy, where the strongest species takes the highest place, and everyone else falls into line beneath them." She paused and let the silence do its work. Work. But that is exactly the thinking that created the Dominion in the first place. And if we replace one empire with another, even a kinder one, even one led by people with good intentions, then we have learned nothing from the suffering that brought us all to this room." She looked at the Keth delegates, whose compound eyes reflected the light of the chamber in fractured patterns, and at the Lirathi, who floated in their water-filled pods with an elegance that made the air itself seem clumsy, and at all the others, who had been crushed under the Dominion's boot for longer than humanity had even existed as a spacefaring species. "Humanity did not fight to build another empire," Elara said, and the words carried a conviction so deep that it resonated in the bones of every being present. "We fought to make sure that no one ever builds one again." She stepped back from the podium and returned to her seat, and the chamber erupted into a sound that was not quite applause. It was something deeper, a release of tension and fear that had been building for 10,000 years, a collective exhale from a galaxy that had forgotten how to breathe. The Assembly elected a council of representatives from 12 species to govern the transition period, and Elara served as an advisor, but never as a leader, because she understood that the most powerful thing she could do was show the galaxy that power could be surrendered willingly. The peace negotiations with the remaining Valori leadership took months, and were painful in ways that no one had anticipated. The Valori had lost their homeworld, their greatest shipyard, and their sense of identity as the rightful rulers of everything, and grief of that magnitude does not negotiate easily. Subcommander Aelith Ran became the unlikely bridge between the two sides. She had spent the months since the Battle of Sol in a strange and painful limbo, too connected to the old regime to be trusted by the freed species, and too aware of the Dominion's crimes to defend it with any conviction. But she had something that no one else on either side possessed. She understood both the Valori and the humans, not as enemies, but as peoples capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary courage. And she used that understanding to find the narrow path between vengeance and justice. It was Aelith who convinced the remaining Valori admirals to surrender unconditionally, arguing with a passion that surprised even herself that the Dominion's only hope of survival as a people was to accept responsibility for what it had done, and begin the long work of earning the galaxy's trust. It was Aelith who stood beside Elara in a private room after the surrender was signed, and the two women, one human, one Valori, looked at each other across a distance that was measured not in meters, but in the ashes of worlds. "I keep thinking about the people on Valor Prime," Aelith said, and her voice was barely more than a whisper. "The ones who had nothing to do with the conquest, the ones who were just living their lives. They did not deserve what happened to them." Elara was silent for a long time before she answered. "No," she said, and her voice was heavy with something that was not regret exactly, but was close enough to share a border with it. "They did not, and I will carry that weight for the rest of my life, and I should carry it. Because the moment we stop feeling the cost of what we did is the moment we become the thing we fought against." The two of them stood in silence, and in that silence was something that might one day grow into understanding, though neither of them was ready to call it that yet. On a bright morning 3 weeks later, Dr. Idris Okonkwo stood on the surface of Earth's moon, surrounded by representatives from every species in the new assembly, and he did something that would be remembered as one of the most important acts in galactic history. He dismantled the third Prometheus warhead. He did it publicly, with cameras broadcasting to every world in the galaxy, and he took it apart piece by piece with his own hands. The same hands that had built the communication network that made the rebellion possible. The same hands that had launched the weapons that destroyed 2 worlds. When the last component was removed, and the warhead was nothing but inert parts spread across a table, Idris looked into the cameras and spoke. "This is the last one," he said, and his voice carried the weariness of a man who had carried the weight of worlds on his shoulders, and was finally setting it down. "May no species ever need to build another." Across the galaxy, beings of every shape and size watched the broadcast, and many of them felt tears or the equivalent of tears, because they understood what they were witnessing. Not just the destruction of a weapon, but the declaration that the Age of Empires was over. In the months that followed, Earth began to heal. Cities that had been scarred by the occupation were rebuilt, not as they had been before, but as something new. Monuments to resilience rather than recreations of the past. Families that had been separated across dozens of worlds were reunited, and the scenes at the spaceports, where parents held children they had not seen in 5 years, were enough to break and remake a heart in the same moment. Memorials were erected on every liberated world, not to human triumph, but to every species that had suffered under the Dominion, because Alara had insisted that the story of liberation belonged to everyone, not just to those who had fired the weapons. The galaxy was not healed. That would take generations, maybe centuries. But it was alive, and it was free, and that was enough to start. On a quiet afternoon, long after the ceremonies and the speeches and the treaties had faded into history, Ilara Voss traveled alone to Cathara V. The Ashenmaw mines were silent now. The machinery had been shut down, the tunnels had been sealed, and the world was in the early stages of being reclaimed by the stubborn red vegetation that had covered it before the Dominion arrived. Ilara walked through the entrance of Tunnel 7 and followed the familiar path deep into the earth, past the places where she had suffered and planned and sworn her oath, until she reached the spot where the child had died all those years ago. The dust was still, and the air was warm, and the silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. She knelt down and placed a small stone on the ground, an old Earth tradition, a way of saying I was here, and I remember. And she stayed there for a long time, not speaking, not crying, just being present in the place where everything had begun. She thought about the boy whose name she had never learned, and she thought about the billions of lives that had been lost on both sides of the war. And she thought about the galaxy that was stumbling toward a future that no one could predict. She did not know if what she had done was right, not entirely, not with the certainty that leaders in stories always seem to have. But she knew that she had done what was necessary, and she knew that the galaxy was freer today than it had been yesterday. And she knew that the small stone on the ground meant something that words could never fully capture. She stood up and walked out of the tunnel and into the red sunlight of Cathara 6, and she did not look back. The galaxy had learned many lessons from the Valori Dominion about power and cruelty and the terrible cost of treating sentient beings as property. But the one lesson it would never forget, the one whispered in fear and reverence across 1,000 worlds, in languages both spoke and telepathic, by species that crawled and flew, and swam and floated, was simple. Humanity could be broken. Humanity could be chained. But humanity could never, ever be kept.